The country has seen similar deployments in 2019. That's when the SANDF was sent to the streets of the Western Cape to try to deal with gang-related crimes there. But there's been an overarching question asked about whether or not this is actually the role of the army. Let's get the perspective of the head of military strategy at Stellenbosch University's Military Academy. That's Professor Abel Esterhuyse, who joins us now via our video link. Prof, thanks for your time and patience. It's great to have you on the program. I really do appreciate it. You know, the army is said to essentially be put together to defend any country, including ours here in South Africa, from external threats. But given just how widespread the impact of illegal mining is it justifiable to send the army to try to deal with this issue?
Yeah, I think one has to take an historical view on this. Since the creation of the Union in 1910, the military has always been utilized inside the country. Whether it was in the 1922 white industrial strike on the Rand, whether it's the 1980s, the military in South Africa have always been part of the security apparatus inside the country. I think that's an historical fact. The problem is, and this is a major issue, I think, at present, in the 1990s, the decision was made, and they started the defense planning since the 1990s based on the assumption that the military will in future take responsibility for domestic security and the military will only be utilized for external missions. That was in the 1990s. And so since then, the military has lost a lot of experience in domestic deployment. It has lost its doctrine, its equipment, its infrastructure to actually deploy inside the country, which means it has a logistical challenge when it's deploying inside the country. It is intelligence. It is challenged in terms of intelligence. So the military finds it increasingly difficult to deploy inside the country because it does not have the infrastructure anymore to deploy inside the country. I think that's a critical issue at present that we need to consider, based on the assumption in the 1990s that the military will not be deployed inside the country. But there's another...
Please go ahead,
Sorry.
Prof.
No, there's another story here, and I think it's becoming a bit of a repetitive story in a way. On the one hand, the argument that the military is overcommitted, and the military is overcommitted. Deployed inside Africa, the DRC, Mozambique, deployed on the borders for border duty. The military, as Sandy Africa rightly pointed out in her 2021 report to the president after the KwaZulu-Natal uprisings, the military is not only overcommitted, it is a hollowed-out institution, was the word she was using. And so we're sitting with a bit of a problem here because on the one hand, the military, I think, is not really prepared for domestic deployments. And on the other hand, and this is important, increasingly government is using the military as a type of stopgap institution. And Sandy Africa also talked about that, the way in which the military is increasingly being used by government as a stopgap institution.
Right. One certainly gets the sense that, you know, what the military has now been expected to do surely should be in the ambit of other arms of our law enforcement, including the police. But we'll come to that in just a moment. I'm just interested in finding out a bit more about what you've mentioned around there being logistical challenges around domestic deployments. That raises the question around the difference between a domestic deployment and a foreign mission, if you like.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not that the military is perhaps unprepared, but, you know, in the 1990s, you had a whole infrastructure inside the country that allowed the military to deploy inside the country. You had different commands. You have group headquarters. At that time, you even had the commando system still in place that played an essential role in providing intelligence from the bottom up. And provide logistical support and infrastructure. Today, we don't have that because for the last 30 years, the assumption was that the military will not deploy inside the country. So in the past and up until the 1990s, if the military had to deploy in a particular area, you basically could drop all the personnel there, and the infrastructure in terms of intelligence and logistics will be in place, and they will be supported almost locally by the military. Today, everything ought to be deployed from a central point, and from a top-down approach is perhaps the best way to explain it, instead as from a bottom-up approach. So this is just the way, and this is typically of the assumption that we started, to use for defense planning in the 1990s. With basically no infrastructure, military infrastructure in the country for that kind of deployment. And the infrastructure that is in place, I don't think is really capable to handle a huge deployment like this, because we're talking about a brigade-sized deployment here.
Sure. There's going to be a lot of questions about whether this is also money well spent, but I suppose another question that comes up, given what you've just mentioned, is if this is going to be an effective deployment. What's your take on that?
Yeah, perhaps one has to be a bit philosophical here, domestic deployments of the military, we know from a theoretical perspective and from a historical perspective, is never a good idea. We've seen that in South Africa in the 1970s, 1980s. We've seen it in Los Angeles in the middle of the 1990s. We've seen it in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s. We have so many historical examples that highlights the fact that you need to be very cautious in deploying your military inside the country. There's another problem with deploying inside the country, and that has to do with the institutional nature and makeup of militaries. Militaries are trained for war fighting. Militaries are equipped for war fighting. Military's doctrine is an adversarial doctrine. Militaries, unlike the police, is in terms of its culture, its doctrine, its equipment, not really prepared for the kind of, almost want to say, soft security operations that ought to be done within your own country and amongst your own people. And we've seen it to some extent during the lockdown deployments, where the military was criticized for being too harsh. So from a cultural and organizational perspective and from a historical perspective, we know that the deployment of the military is never a good idea inside your country. But then at the same time, let's consider the uniqueness of this deployment. And the uniqueness of this deployment, I think, is that it is a rather unique problem, that clearly here you're sitting with a very adversarial type of situation with the miners that is clearly a clearly identifiable group that you can deal with. But yeah, the military is not prepared. The military is not trained for this kind of operations.
Sure. Sobering insights. Thanks, as always, for speaking to us.
Can I make a last point? Yeah.
Go ahead, Prof.
I think, we've seen the private security industry, for example, being very, very good in dealing with this kind of situation. So I think one should have a new kind of approach here in which you perhaps co-opt the private industry that have developed over time the capacity and the capabilities to execute and to conduct these kind of operations. And I think it is time for us to think anew about our security inside the country and how we go about establishing our security, and that we bring the private security industry into the planning and the infrastructural capability of government to deal with this problem.
Absolutely. And hopefully the private security is also willing to kind of help government share the financial burden of that, given the fact that if we sort this out, everyone stands to benefit. Professor Esterhuyse, as always, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really appreciate your time. Professor Abel Esterhuyse is with Stellenbosch University's Military Academy.